Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's Financial Security for All Community of Practice webinar for educators who work in the personal finance area. We've been doing these for several years. They're usually once a month. We're hosting them here at the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture Cooperative Extension Service out of our Little Rock State Office headquarters. We've had quite a variety of topics over the years, and I'm really excited to be with a group today who've been working on issues around climate change and financial stability. I think you're going to be really excited to see the tools that this work group has developed around 52 ways to climate-proof your finances. And I wanted to give a little shout out. And with us today is Jenny Abel. Jenny's been providing leadership to this group. Wanted to recognize some of the other team members who worked on putting this presentation together for you. Erica Toby, Michigan State University. Sarah Kroymans is in Minnesota. Elizabeth Kish, who I'm not sure she's joining us today, but she's with Kansas State University. Portia Johnson at Auburn University. Lorna Sobe Wounded Head, who is in South Dakota. And then I'm fortunate to be part of this team here with University of Arkansas. Also joining us today is Scott Hirschberger. Scott's going to share about some research around communication and climate change. So we're really excited to kind of get, this is kind of our first little teaser about the 52 ways material, but please also come by our session at NEA-FCS if you happen to be there. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over now to Erica and Jenny.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Laura. So we're going to start out. Let me just get the PowerPoint presentation. So thank you, everybody, for participating and being a part of our 52 ways to climate-proof your finances. So to get us started, the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to ask you two questions. And in a second here, I'm going to put a Mentimeter PowerPoint up and ask you to put in the chat and answer the questions based on these two questions. So the first one is, what types of climate-related events have occurred or could potentially occur in your community? And then the second one is, how have or could these climate events affect your personal financial situation or the financial situations of those in your community? So let me put on our Mentimeter really quick here. And if you could please use the Mentimeter code, and I believe that is, Andrea's put that in the chat as well. But if you could please just use that code and put your responses here for what types of climate-related events have occurred or could occur in your community. Okay, very good. So we're seeing some fires, we're seeing floods, again, wildfires. Looks like flood, we're getting numerous responses there, blizzards. Absolutely. So all of these are different things that could be climate-related events that could occur or have occurred in your community. More rain, absolutely. Tornadoes, so definitely. So starting to see, again, more of these climate-related issues. Heat waves, wonderful, wonderful. Earthshake, earthquake, okay. Storms, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much for that first question. So I think that gets us a little bit on what are some of the issues that we're starting to see. Now let's look at, drought, very good. Thank you very much. Okay, so next one is, how have or could these climate events affect your personal financial situation? So this was one of the big questions that we tackled. And actually these two questions, when we developed the lesson plan for this toolkit, we actually these are two of the brainstorming questions that we encourage you to ask your participants if you were to offer this in your community. So what are some of the things that you think, how could these affect your personal financial situation as you're thinking about this? Absolutely, missing work days, car issues, insurance coverages, definitely. We talk a lot about insurance within this toolkit. Okay, absolutely, insurance is coming up again. Okay, increasing utility bills. Absolutely. And that's something that we're going to be talking about what are some of the strategies or ways you could be thinking about reducing those utility costs that you have. Absolutely, evacuation costs and really any type of costs related to displacement when some of these issues do occur. Home damage, absolutely. Health issues, wonderful. Yes, not that any of these issues are wonderful, but these are wonderful comments and suggestions. So thank you so much. Repairs not covered, absolutely. Missing work days, loss of assets, great. So this is definitely getting on the wavelength of some of the things that we've been talking about, and really, I think gives a good synopsis and really introduction to what we've tried to do with this toolkit. So I'm going to close the Mentimeter, and I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint here really quick. And I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who is going to talk about our team and really how we got started as a team. So Jenny, turning it over to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Erica. So yeah, we just want to give a little bit of information about our origin story, how we came to create the tool that you're going to hear more about in just a few minutes. So all of us are members of the Financial Security for All community of practice, as I imagine many of you on this call are. So this is a group of extension financial education professionals that meets monthly. About 3 years ago, a subset of that group decided to form the Climate Change Impacts on Family Resource Management subgroup. Actually, if you could go back, Erica, sorry. So we decided to form that the Climate Change Impacts on Family Resource Management subgroup. And then from that group, a subgroup of that team decided to form about a year ago to create this 52 Ways to Climate Proof Your Finances team. Now please go to the next slide. So here is a list of all of the members on that team, and you heard Laura mention many of these at the top of the program. Just a couple of ones that I wanted to highlight in addition to those that she mentioned are Carrie, who is one of Carrie Grishaber, who's one of Erica's colleagues at Michigan State, Kelly Sipple from University of Delaware, and Chris Sneed from University of Tennessee. So all together, this team represents 9 different state university extension systems. Okay, next slide. So what was the motivation 3 years ago for us to form the CCI and FRM team? So partly it was because we noticed that USDA NIFA was starting to talk about climate change, but most of the discussions were around the impacts on agriculture and natural resources, and we felt it was important for those of us in financial education to have a voice at the table. We also had a lot of questions about how to message, how, when, and what to say, because climate change can be a very charged term and a very politically polarizing topic in some communities. Also, as we were just talking about through the Menti, we see a large connection between disaster preparedness and climate change. Next slide. So we've got some statistics here and information on research showing more on that connection. And this one in the circle on the left is particularly prominent. I think the fact that a huge majority of adults in the country, 78%, have been personally affected by one or more of the extreme weather events that you all listed in the Mentimeter just a little bit ago in just the past 5 years. And so I think we all know the impact that these events can have on personal finances. They can cause disruptions in people's work. They can reduce people's ability to pay bills. They can increase delinquency on debts and on mortgage payments. And also it's challenging often for communities and insurers to respond and provide the help that families and households need to respond to these disasters. Next slide. So about 2 years ago, at a FIRMA conference, we had a session and we asked some of the questions on the screen here that are similar to the ones that Erica asked at the top of the presentation. And you can see a snapshot here of a Jamboard that we created from that. So again, kind of just trying to figure out where is our place in these discussions and how can we bring these issues more to the forefront. Next slide. So we decided that the mission of the larger climate change impacts on family resource management team is to be a repository of educational resources that will help families and individuals be proactive on these issues. And specifically, we want to help households become resilient and manage the risks of climate change. And we want to also help people be able to adapt to conditions that are changing really rapidly in some cases in some of our communities. Next slide. And then, so how did we come up a year ago to decide on creating the tool that you're going to hear about in just a second? We were inspired greatly by the passage of the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act that was passed this month, in fact, 2 years ago. And that provides billions of dollars for communities and households to make energy saving improvements. We also, this increased incidence that we've been talking about already of natural disasters. And we're seeing increased evidence from other researchers and governmental bodies that are drawing the connection between climate change and personal finances. One of the key things was the resource that you see in the lower right corner. And that's a tool that was released last fall by the Department of Treasury. It's sort of a resource guide for households on how they can mitigate the impacts of climate change. So that's what led us to create the tool. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Erica to share more about this tool that we have put together.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. So really excited to share a little bit about this 52 ways to climate proof your finances tool. I believe Andrea is going to put in the chat the link for this tool that you can get, as well as there is a QR code on the screen as well. As you can see on the right of the screen, you can see that we start out with some background research information. One of the things that we wanted to do within this tool is really provide some resources and information and background knowledge of talking a little bit about climate challenges and some of the effects that it can have on your finances. On the middle green sheet there, you're going to see all the various topics that we have, or some of the various topics that we've really divided the toolkit around. So thinking about areas such as personal finances, insurance, we're going to talk about some of these particular steps as well, but providing some topics to really get a sense of what are some of the things that may occur when we're thinking about how we can really shore up our finances relating to climate change. And then finally, you're going to see a snapshot of the toolkit itself, where you can actually see that each one has action items, as well as notes for you to document what's happening, as well as a time, a date reference, where you can actually date when these particular things occur. And this is really set up like an action tool for you. So the objectives of the tool is we want to help understand how climate change can affect your personal finances. We wanted individuals to be able to identify some steps that they can take to be able to climate proof their financial situation. And then this tool is really set up as a personal action plan. And what we hoped is that people could continue to revisit this plan, to work on this plan as needed, and really help them think about how they can organize and strategize around thinking about their financial situation in this way. It also encourages prioritization, and it helps people complete and think about the different tasks that they may need to do within these various areas. Within the tool, I showed you that first page. There is some information about some background research. And really one of the things that we tried to do, and Jenny set this up really well as well, was we wanted to talk about the fact that climate change consequences are substantial and escalating, and they are starting to increase in severity, extent, and frequency. And so when these things occur, How are they affecting households? How are they affecting families? And how does your financial situation really come into play? So talking about the fact that families are vulnerable and that this is really the time to take action of your own personal financial situation. So the way that this tool is really developed is really allows people to be able to review the list and really look through that list and identify what are some of the tasks that you feel you could take action on. Now, as people are reading through this list, there might be things that they're already doing, and so they may just be able to skip right over those tasks. There might be other tasks that feel a little bit more daunting, and maybe there's some additional steps that need to happen. So what we have is really a list of tasks where people can identify what are some of the ones that they want to take prioritization on, and really think about what are some of those dates that they may want to complete them. How this tool is really set up is that they can then track their progress, and then we have a little bit of a celebration section as well to really celebrate your successes and realizing this is going to be an ongoing opportunity for people to do. Now, a few things to think about is that this is not a tool where everybody's going to do every single one of these steps. In fact, there's 52 different ways that they can think about climate proofing their finances. And if somebody wants to complete all 52, that's wonderful. But that wasn't the intention when we thought about this. You don't have to finish them all. In fact, this just gives you some ideas and suggestions and to really think about what's going to work well for your household. The other thing to think about is that some of these tasks are actually seasonal. So for instance, there might be things that are identified on this or action items that are identified that make sense to happen in the winter or in the summer. And so really identifying based on the particular task, what might be the best time for their particular situation. And then finally, the other thing to think about is that some of these are one-time tasks, so people will complete them and then they will be done. Others may be needing ongoing updating or revisions or follow-up. Some of these things may happen on an ongoing basis. So really, when people are looking at this list and when participants are looking at this list, it's really getting a sense of what's going to work for them, when do these things need to happen, and what's going to be the best strategy to think about prioritization for themselves. So I want to take a second here to really share with you some of the different areas and some of the different categories that we have related to the tool. As you can see, when we talk about this, we had talked about the fact that there's different categories. So this first category talks about personal finances. And as you can see, it's really some of the things, if you've been teaching financial literacy for many years, this is something where a lot of the basic core financial education concepts that we typically think about. So one of the first things we talk about is securing your important family papers. So that might be thinking about what are those important family papers that you have and what are some of the places that you need to keep that. So is it a safe deposit box? Where is that held? Okay, or do you have a fireproof safe? What does that look like? So thinking about what are some of those important papers, where are they at, and how can you really start to track that? It's also thinking about creating a household inventory. So maybe it's simply walking around with a phone camera and being able to identify and video all the different things that you have in your home. If something were to happen and you needed to be able to replace those items, it's really creating that household inventory so you have that. So we have things like that. We also have things like developing an emergency fund. For those of you that have taught financial management, this is a core concept that we talk about, having your 3 to 6 month emergency fund as well. So this really talks about how do we best prepare our financial situation when we think about our personal finances as well. And things like diversifying your investments and creating a spending plan are key to that. The next category highlights various action items related to insurance. So when we talk about insurance, we talk about what are some of the insurances that you have, understanding some of the coverages, and really reviewing those policies before something were to happen. So that when something does happen, you can really be prepared and understand what your policy covers and what that looks like. You also want to know what are some of the exemptions. And so we have an action list item that really talks about that. And if there are exemptions, what do you need to do to make sure that you are fully covered? We talk about making sure that you have insurance for items that maybe aren't covered. So really understanding that. And then checking for coverages. If for some reason there's something that happens and you need to make repairs. So for instance, maybe you need to board up windows. Can you get reimbursed for that? Or if you have spoiled food, what might that look like? We also have some items in this action list that we may not necessarily think about related to personal finances, but it's really thinking about sustainability of our resources and using our resources wisely. So one of the categories that we have in here is talking about clothing, shoes, and laundry. It's thinking about things like mending your clothes and shoes, or only buying what's needed as a part of it. This is an example of one of those seasonal categories. Things like wearing layers when it's colder, or adjusting the thermostat depending on the season that you have. We also talk about reviewing different laundry options. Sometimes with particular utility companies, you may be charged if you do laundry at certain peaks of the day. So thinking about what those types of aspects related to your finances are as well. We also have some topics focusing on food. Okay, so again, thinking about sustainability of your resources, making sure that you're being a good consumer of your resources. So it might be things like preparing a grocery list. There's also items related to environmental and your food. So thinking about considering substituting red meat with plant proteins like beans, tofu, tempeh, and nuts. Plant-based proteins typically cost less, and the CO2 emissions from their production are 10 to 50 times lower than animal products. So again, thinking about different ways when we're thinking about the food category that we have. Now, we also have a variety of topics, a few pages of topics related to housing, and really thinking about and really launching from the Inflation Reduction Act that Jenny had mentioned earlier. So when you're thinking about housing, there's a variety of things that we can think about. We can start out with an energy audit, for instance. And within the Inflation Reduction Act, you can actually get a tax credit to cover 30% of the cost up to $150. So again, having somebody come in, helping you identify what are some of the ways that you can make energy efficient updates in your home. There's also, when we think about housing, some of these may cost a little bit of money aside, but others may be a minimal cost that you can have. Things like reducing your air leaks by caulking and weather stripping. So we've tried to give a variety of different examples of different ways that you can be able to make energy efficient updates in your home. We talk a lot about reviewing rebates and tax opportunities, tax credit opportunities. So again, and this is a good example, I would say, of things that don't all have to happen at once. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, you do have a few years to be able to take advantage of some of those tax credits and rebates that are available. It's also important to note that different states are really releasing some of this information at different times. So checking to see what's available at the state level as well is very important. Also, some utility companies may have rebates that are in addition to what's being offered as well. So some of the ideas that we have within this area are thinking about things like replacing appliances or making some of these energy efficient replacements with your furnace or your windows. And again, through the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a variety of different tax credits and rebates you can take in this area. We also talk a lot about being prepared. And when we're thinking about financial preparedness, it could be simple as creating an action plan, or talking about preparing a go bag, stay bin, and grab and go file. So a go bag is a bag that has a change of clothes, chargers for phones, medications, spare glasses, and things you might need. A stay bin can include a 2-week supply of food and water. So again, thinking about what are some of the ways that you can be prepared if something were to happen. We also give simple examples like subscribing to emergency alerts or having cash on hand so that if you have to make a quick getaway, you have the ability to be able to do that and you have some resources. And then finally, we also talk about some various tax credits you can take advantage of. And again, this correlates us really closely with the Inflation Reduction Act. We talk about various ways that you can think about transportation. And one good example is electric car options. And again, with the Inflation Reduction Act, there are opportunities to be able to take advantage of that. And then finally, exploring public transit. And then the last item is really thinking about this whole area as a career. And so thinking about researching careers when you're thinking about the whole effect of climate change and your financial situation. So like I said, when we at the beginning here, this tool is available. It is an action tool. And again, there's an opportunity for you to be able to have fill in the blank goal completion. You can track your progress. You can revisit this as many times as you may need. It is not a one and done type of resource, but it is something that you can use ongoing as a part of your financial situation, really thinking about your financial situation. This is also a free printable resource. And the link is in the chat as well that you can access and be able to secure some of these additional resources. So as we're talking about this tool, one of the things that we wanted to be able to really provide you with is, okay, so if we're talking about the issue of climate change related to financial situation, what are some ways that we can best communicate this with the participants that we work with? And so we have Scott on here as well, Scott Hirschberger, who's a master's student from the University of Wisconsin, who's done some research in this area. And so I'm going to turn it over to him to talk a little bit about some research and tips that he's done. Scott?
Great. Thank you, Erica. Yeah, so I just finished my master's degree in science communication at UW-Madison. And I wasn't part of the development of this 52 Ways tool, but it fits in really well with a lot of what I've been learning and researching about best practices for talking and communicating about climate change. And so during my master's program, I have been working in the extension here in Wisconsin in the Natural Resources Institute. And I also did my thesis research on climate change communication within the extension context. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is basically a juxtaposition of my own research on this topic, as well as other social science research and kind of tips and ideas for how to have these conversations with your participants. So just for a little bit of background on climate communication in extension, there have been needs assessments done on this topic in about 6 different states that I've found. And one of the key things that emerges from these is that extension professionals overall do feel like we need to be addressing climate change in our work. But at the same time, more than 60% of extension professionals say their participants are not asking directly for information about climate change. But I think as you're starting to see probably with the different action items on the 52 Ways tool, you're talking with your participants about topics that do relate to climate change, even if they're not coming to you and asking about climate change directly. And so these needs assessments were mostly quantitative. So I wanted to complement that work by doing a qualitative study, an interview-based study, to kind of get more nuance and rich data. So I did semi-structured interviews with Wisconsin Extension educators, as well as program managers, to get another perspective on the topic. I focused on 3 areas in particular. First was crops and soils, community economic development, and most relevant for us today, financial education. I spoke with a total of 15 educators from across the state, representing both urban and rural communities, as well as the program managers from those 3 areas. And the educators had between 6 months and 31 years of experience with Wisconsin Extension. So one of the first things that I wanted to understand was how are folks in the different program areas thinking about the relationship between their work and climate change? And I found a spectrum. So on one end were people in crops and soils who very much saw the connections. They would tell me, I feel like it's behind the scenes of everything that I'm doing. On the other end of the spectrum were my financial education interviewees who would say, I don't feel like the topic of climate change is really impacting what I'm doing. Now, again, they're having conversations that are touching on topics related to climate change. They may just not be thinking of it directly. So, I hope that this 52 Ways tool helps you see, as many connections as possible between your work and climate change, and maybe helps you make those connections for others who you work with in extension who don't see those connections yet. And then the folks I talked with in community economic development really ranged between those 2 extremes, depending on what specific topics they worked on. Now, for those folks, again, even those who aren't perceiving many connections between their work and climate change, I did find in these discussions that they have developed some good strategies for talking about climate change. So I'm going to share a couple of those with you. So the first is a strategy that I think of as going in the back door. A lot of the people I interviewed find the phrase climate change is polarizing and off-putting and not a great way to start a conversation with their clients. And so maybe some of you have had a similar experience in your communities. But if so, the good news is that the words are what they object to, not necessarily to the activities that are being done under those words. And so if this is the situation that you're in, other phrases that you can use instead include things like changing weather patterns, extreme weather, climate variability, and even changing climate might work depending on the context and who you're talking with. So these are different ways to think about, how you're framing the overall topic. And there's, large scale quantitative work that backs up the importance of word choice as well. So this is a study from 2022 where they asked people how willing they were to engage in various behaviors to adapt to the effects of either extreme weather or climate change. Same question, just changing whether you say extreme weather or climate change. And they found that for most of these behaviors, Republicans tended to be more willing to engage in the behavior if it was framed in terms of extreme weather. And for some of them, Democrats were more willing when it was phrased in terms of climate change. So the word choice really does matter, especially because climate change, both as a phrase and a topic, is really tied to people's political identities in the United States. Now, that being said, it's important to remember that a majority of Americans are concerned or alarmed about climate change. Currently, about 57%. Even if they're not talking about it a lot, it's something that worries them and it's on their mind. And so, a lot of times the really dismissive people are the most vocal voices that we're hearing, but they're a small minority. So just important context to keep in mind. And maybe some of the folks in these alarmed and concerned categories are going to come to you and say, hey, I'm really worried about climate change and its impact on my finances. What can I do? But if that's not the case, if they're not coming to you directly and asking about it, really the best way to start the conversation is with something that's specific, local, and relatable for your participants. So I'm going to give an example that came up in my thesis research. So it's obviously local to Wisconsin. But I encourage you to think about, what are the analogous things happening in your state? And we kind of talked about that a little bit at the beginning. A lot of people mentioned floods or hurricanes, wildfires. What are the things happening for the folks where you live? So here in Wisconsin, in the northern part of the state, climate change is causing a lot less snowfall to happen. And that's a problem because winter recreation, like snowmobiling and skiing, is really important both culturally and economically for that part of the state. And so that hurts the income of seasonal workers. So some of my interviewees were helping their constituents apply for grants and emergency loans as kind of a short-term stopgap solution. So when you think about this whole chain of events, really the key aspect of climate change is not what's causing it at the root. It's just that it's a long-term trend. And so a real solution to it necessitates long-term financial planning. So the approach that one of my interviewees was taking was it's more goal setting. What does this mean? Yes, for right now, but also for next year. What kind of steps can you take? Because this could happen again next year. So yeah, again, just finding those specific, local, and relatable ways to kind of start the conversation, get your participants thinking about what they're experiencing and how it's impacting their finances, and maybe bringing in climate change as a kind of a secondary part of that messaging. Now, another aspect to this relates to the kind of the two broad categories of taking action for climate change. And just to make sure we're on the same page, that's in terms of definitions, because I know a lot of people use these terms differently. When I talk about adaptation or resilience, I'm talking about, climate change is happening, planet is warming, and so we react to that. We respond by taking actions to adjust to the new climate in order to moderate the harm or take advantage of potential beneficial opportunities. The flip side of climate action are actions that are mitigation. So this is where we are acting proactively in order to decrease greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon dioxide, and thus reduce the total amount of global warming that we are going to be getting in the coming decades. Now, there's a big overlap between these two categories. A lot of actions have benefits both for resilience and mitigation, and you'll see a lot of those on the 52 Ways tool. For example, eating a more plant-based diet is cheaper, helps with resilience, and it decreases greenhouse gas emissions. It helps with mitigation. Similar thing with using energy efficient appliances or just using less energy in general. But what my interviewees shared with me and what is backed up by other social science research as well is really that focusing on resilience is the most effective way to bring someone into conversation on these topics. So here's what one community economic development educator told me. Adaptation has to be first, because if you can get them to understand how this is going to affect them, you'll get more buy-in. And if you can give them some solutions on how to protect themselves and how to stabilize their own lives, they'll have more energy and willingness to go into the mitigation. So the reason that this is effective comes down to a concept called efficacy, which you can think of as agency or an active form of hope. Basically, when you tell people, here's the big problem the world faces, we don't like that. We kind of try to look away. We don't think about it. We feel disempowered and we don't do anything. Instead, if you tell people, here's the big problem you face and here's what you can do about it, now you're giving people a toolkit. You're telling them, here are the concrete things. You can take these actions and your actions will make a difference. And study after study has shown that a lot of people are concerned about climate change, but not doing anything. And giving them that sense of efficacy is really key to transform that concern into action. And so again, this 52 Ways tool is a really powerful way to bridge that gap and show people what actions they can take concretely. Now, one other thing that I want to touch on that didn't come up in my thesis interviews, but is a really powerful influence on motivating sustainable behavior change is thinking about leveraging social norms. Because humans are very social creatures, we are strongly influenced by people like us, often more strongly influenced than we consciously realize. So there are two types of social norms that can be useful. The first is descriptive norms, which simply answer the question, what do other people do? So an example of how you might invoke a descriptive norm when you're talking with someone is to say 2/3 of people in your neighborhood set their thermostat lower at night in the winter to conserve energy and save money. The other type of norms are injunctive norms, which answer the question, what do other people think is the right thing to do? So it's a bit of a value judgment, what should I be doing? An example of what this sounds like is 2/3 of people in your neighborhood think highly of people who conserve energy at home. Of course, you need the data to back this up, but this is just an example to get your mind going on what are the norms in your community that you could potentially tap into. And I also want to highlight that the more specific you can be with that reference group, the better. Because when it's someone we perceive as close to us in whatever way, a church community, fans of the same sports team, those norms become more powerful in influencing our behavior. And also, the reason that I specifically chose energy use in the home for this example is because there have been a variety of studies done where utility companies have included information on their monthly bills about how people's energy usage compares to their neighbors. And they found that these programs measurably decrease total energy usage, especially among those folks who were using a higher energy than average. They decrease their energy usage in a sustained way as long as this feedback continues. So obviously, most of you probably don't have access to that sort of data, but just think creatively about what are the norms that are sustainable and are good for your community that maybe aren't yet front of mind for the folks that you're working with. So I'm going to wrap up with just one more quote from my interviewees that I think is really helpful in thinking about how we tie this to the broader picture of extension work. This is from someone in financial education who said, first, there's learning about what is climate change, right? What does climate change mean for Wisconsin? And then breaking it down to what does climate change mean to the folks that I work with, to my county, and how do I get that word out? And how do I start incorporating those pieces into programming that I already do? So I hope as you look through this 52 Ways tool, you find that there are a lot of ways you can incorporate this information, these considerations into the programming that you're already doing. And I hope that you can help your colleagues who are not on this webinar see those connections between their work and climate change and really have that local emphasis and help give your participants the tools they need to take action. So with that, if you're interested in further reading or references on anything I talked about, I have a link on my website with those references. I also put it in the chat. And this book by Katherine Hayhoe called Saving Us is great reading. She goes into a lot more detail on how to actually approach productive conversations about climate change. So definitely worth the read if you have not checked that out. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back to the rest of the team.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. That was fabulous. I think those were all really helpful tips. So if you've had a chance to access the resource yet, that we're either via the link that Andrea's been putting in the chat or via that QR code, you've probably noticed that it's housed on the Eden site. Eden is the Extension Disaster Education Network, and we're very grateful to them for hosting the resource. As I mentioned, our team is made up of people from 9 different universities. And so we thought it didn't make sense to house it within one of our universities. We wanted a more central spot. And so, like I said, we're very grateful that Eden agreed to host it for us. We've also been developing lots of supplemental materials to help make it easier for you to use this resource in your communities. Those include things like PowerPoint slides, lesson plans, social media posts, and an evaluation. Those resources are almost complete, and Eden also has a mechanism for us to post those to their site. They will be available to Eden delegates. So because we thought it didn't make sense to have those on the public facing side of Eden's site, given that they're going to be specifically for you, the educators in the communities. So if you know who your delegates are in your state for Eden, once we get those resources posted, you could get in touch with them, or perhaps you are a delegate for your state. And actually, if you're not already a delegate, it's very easy to get added. There's just a form to complete online. And so if you've got questions about how to access those resources, once we get those posted, feel free to reach out to me. We should have those posted within probably the next month. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Laura, who's going to talk a little bit about the evaluation tool that we created.
Thanks, Jenny. Elizabeth, Kish, and I worked on an evaluation tool to go along with the lesson guide and the 52 ways handout and other materials that we have. And the evaluation tool will be available for you to download and print. We'll also have a QR code and a link. On the evaluation tool, it can be sorted by state. So if you'll have your folks complete the evaluation, then you can contact us and we'll send your state-specific data to you. So the questions on it, there's a little bit of intro, where there's a drop-down menu to select state. There's a question about if it was a 30-minute or 60-minute program and about the date of the program. So if you have multiple programs in your state and you want to sort by a specific program that you did on a certain date, we can do that too. And then there are just 5 questions that relate to their knowledge gained, intended behavior change, and then there's an open-ended question. So 5 questions kind of around that, and then a little bit of demographic information that's just what's required by my university to meet our civil rights requirements. So just a few short demographic questions. So we tried to keep it fairly short, but that will all be available for you to use as well.